The small town of Millfield, Ohio, was the kind of place you'd find tucked away on any map of America. A speck of calm in the vast countryside, with streets named after trees and centuries-old brick buildings that had weathered generations. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, where the pace of life matched the gentle roll of the nearby river, and where everyone knew their neighbor's face, and, often, their story. The kind of town where doors were left unlocked at night, where children played in the streets until twilight, and where the biggest excitement was the annual fall festival in the town square. But, on the edge of this peacefulness, a flicker was growing, quiet, almost imperceptible. A whisper of smoke in the night, the faintest crackle of flames, the unsettling feeling that beneath the town's serene veneer, something was burning. It started just after midnight on a late autumn evening. The Hendersons' house on Maple Street had stood for nearly a century. Its red bricks, ivy-clad walls, and wraparound porch had witnessed family milestones, neighborhood gatherings, and the slow, inevitable passing of time. Albert and Evelyn Henderson were fixtures in Millfield, both retired school teachers who had raised their children in that house and had since settled into a routine of quiet evenings and early morning walks. That night, the first call came just before 1 a.m. A neighbor noticed a soft orange glow licking the edges of the Hendersons' roof, a warm light that shouldn't have been there. The volunteer fire department rumbled to life, engines coughing to the scene with familiar urgency. The Hendersons, shaken awake by the crackling noise and the smell of smoke, barely escaped with their lives. They stood on the street in their pajamas, watching helplessly as their home, their history, was swallowed by flames. The official report cited faulty wiring as the cause, a tragic accident that happens to old houses, the kind everyone expected. Millfield's residents were sympathetic but moved on. Fires happened even in the safest towns. But then, weeks later, another blaze erupted. This time at the old Barton Barn, a structure abandoned for years on the outskirts of town. This fire was no accident. A worn-down barn, empty for ages, set ablaze at precisely 2:13 a.m. on a Sunday. The fire was intense, controlled, and clearly started deliberately. The volunteer firefighters were exhausted. 2 fires in as many weeks were unusual, but the town's faith in luck and coincidence remained intact. Still, a handful of residents exchanged uneasy glances, whispering about strange patterns and bad luck. Then the fires kept coming. A storefront on Main Street went up in smoke, a place where children bought penny candies. A young couple's house burned in the early morning hours, the family barely making it out in time. Each fire seemed unrelated on the surface, but as the ash settled, little details began to emerge. Details that set Millfield's nerves on edge. At the Barton Barn fire, investigators found a strange item near the scene. A playing card, charred and twisted, but unmistakably the Queen of Hearts. No one claimed it, and no one could explain its presence. At the Johnson family house, next to the burnt remains of a favorite necklace, a fragment of a photograph was recovered. A man's face, partially obscured by smoke damage. Again, no clue as to why it was there. Whispers began to spread about a signature, a twisted calling card left behind by whoever was setting these fires. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others were gripped by a growing fear that this was more than arson. It was a message. Amidst these fires and mysteries, a shadow moved through Millfield. Several neighbors reported seeing a figure in a dark hoodie, wandering near the sites shortly before the fires started. One witness swore it was a tall man, walking slowly, pausing as if to savor the sight of the flames taking hold. But by the time the fire trucks arrived, the figure was gone, vanished into the night like a ghost. The town's volunteer firefighters, led by Chief Jerry Wallace, worked tirelessly. Their uniforms were singed, their faces lined with exhaustion, but the fires refused to stop. Each morning brought fresh devastation. Homes, barns, shops, and each time, the town's heart ached a little more. But what kept people up at night wasn't just the flames. It was the unnerving sense that someone was watching, waiting, and playing a dark game. At the center of this mounting tension was the community's tight-knit fabric, fraying thread by thread. Neighbors stopped inviting each other over for coffee. Children were kept inside after sunset. Windows were shuttered earlier than usual, and every knock at the door after dark was met with hesitation. Even the local diner, once a hub of laughter and stories, grew quiet. It was in this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that the first questions were whispered openly. Was this a string of unrelated accidents? Or was someone deliberately tearing Millfield apart? And if so, why? In the early days, suspicion was vague. The town's sheriff, Tom Edwards, urged calm. "We'll find who's behind this," he promised at town meetings. But until then, let's not jump to conclusions. Yet, behind the reassuring words, there was a worry that gnawed at him. These fires weren't natural. They were deliberate, and whoever was lighting them was clever, always just out of reach, always slipping through the cracks. At the fire scene on Maple Street, a young firefighter named Lucas became obsessed with one detail: the timing of the fires. Each blaze started shortly after midnight, between 12:30 and 2:30 a.m. The fires weren't random in time or place. They were staged with chilling precision. Lucas, a Millfield native, spent hours poring over reports and fire patterns, convinced that whoever was responsible was sending a message, or worse, playing a game. One night, Lucas was out driving near the edge of town, retracing the routes between fires. It was nearly midnight when he caught sight of a figure standing just beyond the tree line. A man with his hood up, watching the town. Lucas's heart raced. The figure didn't move, just stared. Then, without warning, the man disappeared into the darkness. Lucas reported the sighting to the sheriff, but with no clear evidence, it was dismissed as a trick of the light. Still, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling. The fires were connected, and the arsonist was no stranger. Millfield's sense of normalcy was breaking down. Insurance rates spiked. Property values plummeted. Local businesses feared for their future. And as the fires multiplied, so did the rumors. Some said it was the work of a crazed pyromaniac. Others whispered about insurance fraud, and a few even dared to say something far more sinister. One thing was certain: Millfield was no longer the safe haven it once was. The smoke was thickening, and with it, the growing dread that the flames were just the beginning. As dawn broke over Millfield, the town held its breath, waiting for the next fire. The days following the Henderson's fire brought an uneasy quiet to Millfield, but it was the kind of silence that feels loud, the silence before a storm. Townsfolk moved about their daily routines with forced smiles and furtive glances, their nerves frayed by the growing string of blazes. Despite the mounting fear, life trudged on. The bakery still smelled of fresh bread every morning. Kids played in the park under watchful eyes, and the sun still set over the sleepy rooftops, painting the sky blood red as if warning of the coming darkness. But beneath this routine, the undercurrent of suspicion began to ripple faster. Among the first to feel the weight of the town's gaze was a man whose name soon became whispered in the shadows: Mark Donovan. Mark was a fixture on the town's edge, a loner whose presence had always been met with a mix of curiosity and wariness. He was tall, lean, and gaunt, with pale eyes that never quite seemed to meet yours. His home was a dilapidated farmhouse at the end of Willow Lane, a place as weather-beaten and mysterious as the man himself. Mark kept to himself. He worked odd jobs, mostly nights, at the local warehouse, his shifts often ending just as the first fires were breaking out. To Millfield's wary observers, Mark was the embodiment of other, a man with no family, no friends, no visible ties to the community, moving like a shadow through the streets. When the fires began, the townsfolk's glances inevitably shifted toward him. It started with a few offhand remarks in the diner. "Did you see Mark out by the Johnson place last night? He was nowhere near town when the fire started. I don't trust him." At first, the whispers were subtle, the suspicions tentative. But as the fires continued, fueled by fear and uncertainty, the murmurs grew louder, bleeding into outright accusations. The sheriff, Tom Edwards, found himself under increasing pressure to act. His phone rang late into the night. Messages piled up from concerned parents and restless business owners. "Catch the bastard," one caller barked. "Keep us safe." Sheriff Edwards knew better than to jump to conclusions. There was no concrete evidence linking Mark Donovan to the fires, only rumors and fear. Still, the unease in the town was palpable, and he ordered a discreet surveillance operation. For days, deputies trailed Mark. They watched as he left his rundown farmhouse just after dusk, heading toward the industrial area where the warehouse stood. His shifts were long and solitary. When the fires ignited, Mark was often off-site, but always close enough to raise eyebrows. One night, Deputy Rachel Mills spotted him near the old Barton barn just hours before it was engulfed in flames. Mark's silhouette was blurry against the dark, his posture tense but unreadable. When she moved closer, he vanished into the woods. Mark's life was an enigma. Born in another state, his childhood was marked by instability. Foster homes replaced family, transient moves replaced stability, and the rough edges of his upbringing hardened him into a man who trusted no one. In Millfield, he was a ghost, existing but unseen, a question without answers. Locals filled in the blanks with stories. He talks to himself. He keeps strange hours. I heard yelling coming from his house late at night. But these stories, like smoke, were intangible. There was no proof, no truth to anchor them. The first real break came from a neighbor, Mrs. Dolores Kimball, an elderly widow living across the street from Mark. One evening, she called the sheriff's office. Her voice was shaky but determined. "I think Mark's in trouble, or maybe he's hiding something." Mrs. Kimball described odd noises she'd heard. Banging, strange metallic sounds, and the faint smell of smoke coming from Mark's property. She claimed to have seen him carrying something heavy in the dead of night. Sheriff Edwards authorized a search warrant. When deputies entered Mark's home, they found a cramped, chaotic interior. Boxes piled high, walls covered with newspaper clippings about fires and arson cases from around the country, and an assortment of tools scattered across a workbench. But no evidence of recent fires, no accelerants, no matches or lighters. Mark himself was found sitting silently on a threadbare couch, his expression blank. He neither confirmed nor denied the allegations, only whispering, "I'm not who you think I am." Despite the lack of incriminating evidence, the search intensified the town's suspicion. The media caught wind of the raid, painting Mark as the likely arsonist. Headlines called him Millfield's Phantom and the Man Who Watches. But Sheriff Edwards remained cautious. "We can't arrest a man on suspicion alone," he reminded the town repeatedly. "We need proof." Meanwhile, Mark Donovan's life grew stranger. At the warehouse, his co-workers spoke of his odd behavior. He avoided eye contact, rarely spoke, and often appeared lost in thought. One night, a colleague reported hearing Mark muttering cryptic phrases. "They watch, they wait. The fire reveals the truth." Was this madness, or was Mark trying to tell them something? As the fires raged on, Mark's personal history came under the microscope. Digging into public records, the sheriff's office uncovered a trail of minor offenses. Petty theft, trespassing, but nothing violent. Still, there was a darker shade. Reports of psychological evaluations, hospitalizations for mental health, and unexplained disappearances from foster homes. One cold evening, Sheriff Edwards met with Mark face to face at the station. The interrogation room was stark, bare walls, a metal table, a single bulb casting long shadows. "Mark, we need to know if you had anything to do with these fires," the sheriff said gently. Mark's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "I watch," he whispered. "I see things others don't. The fires, they're warnings." The conversation spiraled into confusion. Was Mark confessing, or was he rambling? Was he a tormented soul caught in his own nightmare, or a master manipulator? That same night, a fire broke out at the abandoned Millfield School. The town's worst fears were realized when firefighters discovered scorch marks arranged in a pattern on the gym floor, symbols that seemed ritualistic, ominous. The fires weren't random anymore. They were deliberate acts of message and menace. Amidst this turmoil, a community meeting was held at the town hall. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. Voices clamored for answers, for justice. "Lock him up," one man shouted, pointing at a photo of Mark Donovan displayed on the projector. Others pleaded for calm. Sheriff Edwards stood at the podium, his face weary but resolute. "We will find the person responsible," he promised. "But we cannot sacrifice justice for fear." As the meeting adjourned, a mysterious figure watched from the back. A man in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. No one recognized him. He slipped out before anyone could ask questions. Over the next weeks, the fires continued. Mark Donovan's alibis grew stronger. He was seen miles away during some of the most destructive blazes. Surveillance footage cleared him on critical nights. Yet, the town's obsession with Mark only deepened. In a desperate attempt to clear his name, Mark invited Sheriff Edwards to his home. The interior was stark but orderly, unlike the chaos deputies had reported before. Mark showed the sheriff an old journal filled with sketches, maps of the town, detailed notes about fire behavior, and symbols matching those found at the school gym. "I'm trying to understand," Mark said quietly, "to stop whoever is doing this." Sheriff Edwards left Mark's house troubled. If Mark Donovan wasn't the arsonist, then who was? A break came when Deputy Rachel Mills found surveillance footage from a gas station near the industrial park. It showed a shadowy figure, dressed in black, moving swiftly near the Johnson farm hours before the fire. The figure paused, looking directly into the camera. The face was obscured, but the way the figure moved, confident, deliberate, suggested a familiarity with the town and its rhythms. As the investigation widened, so did the list of suspects. People with grudges, with access to accelerants, with motives buried beneath layers of deceit. But the elusive man who watches remained out of reach. Millfield's nights grew darker, colder, and more fearful. Neighbors installed alarms, youth groups organized patrols, and the sheriff's office doubled its night shifts. Yet the fires persisted, and Mark Donovan, he became both a scapegoat and an unlikely ally. A man misunderstood and feared, but perhaps closer to the truth than anyone suspected. The line between victim and suspect blurred. As the town grappled with paranoia and dread, one chilling fact emerged. The arsonist wasn't just burning buildings. He was burning the very trust that held Millfield together. The flames were no longer just destroying property. They were consuming lives. It was a crisp October night when the call came in. The Johnson family farmhouse, a sprawling two-story home on the northern edge of Millfield, was engulfed in thick, black smoke, visible from miles away. When the volunteer fire department arrived, the fire was already racing through the old wooden beams, the heat intense and unforgiving. The firefighters fought desperately to contain the blaze, but the structure was no match for the inferno. But this fire was different. Inside the home, amid the choking smoke and crumbling beams, lay the lifeless bodies of the Johnson family. Harold, his wife Marie, and their teenage son, Tommy. Their deaths were no accident. It wasn't the fire that killed them, but something far more sinister. The investigation revealed chilling evidence. All three had suffered blunt force trauma before the flames consumed their bodies. The fire was set deliberately to cover up murder. For the small town of Millfield, this marked a horrific turning point. The Johnson family had been pillars of the community. Harold was a respected mechanic, Marie volunteered at the local library, and Tommy was a star athlete in his final year of high school. Their deaths sent shockwaves through the town, shattering the fragile sense of safety that had already been fraying. Sheriff Edwards and his team approached the investigation with renewed urgency and dread. The first responders described the scene as one of the most harrowing they had ever encountered. Inside the gutted home, remnants of the family's life were scattered amid the wreckage. A charred baseball glove, a scorched photograph of the Johnsons smiling at a summer picnic, and a mother's favorite necklace, twisted beyond recognition. The firefighters' initial hope that the family had escaped was crushed when search teams found the bodies in the master bedroom. Their injuries consistent with blunt force trauma, likely inflicted just minutes before the fire was set. The fire was clearly used as a tool to destroy evidence, a calculated attempt to erase the killer's tracks. Investigators combed the scene for clues, Fire investigators quickly determined that the blaze had been started with a powerful accelerant, gasoline, sprayed in strategic patterns to ensure rapid ignition and destruction. But the killer had been careless in one crucial aspect. A cigarette butt, found in the backyard, retained traces of a rare chemical compound, an additive used only by a small number of factories within 100 miles. It was a lead that sparked hope in the investigation. DNA swabs were taken from the cigarette butt and from other arson scenes. But despite repeated tests, no match was found in the county's database. It was as if the killer had no criminal record, no past, a ghost. Witnesses came forward with fragments of information. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices coming from the Johnson house just hours before the fire. Another described a man carrying a large duffel bag walking briskly down the road near the time the fire broke out. Descriptions were vague. Tall, dark clothes, hooded. No one could confirm the identity. The news of the Johnson murders rocked Millfield. At the funeral, hundreds gathered to mourn the family. The town square overflowed with flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. Mayor Linda Cartwright addressed the crowd with a trembling voice. "We have lost not just a family, but a part of ourselves," she said. "We will stand together, stronger and united, to face this darkness." But behind the hopeful words, a shadow of doubt and terror lingered. People locked their doors tighter. Parents held their children closer. Every creak in the night became a threat. The volunteer fire department, once celebrated as heroes, now carried a heavier burden, fighting not just flames but the growing panic consuming the town. Inside the sheriff's office, the mood was somber and tense. Detective Sarah Collins, the lead investigator on the Johnson case, sat alone at her desk late into the night, poring over files and evidence. She was a seasoned detective, known for her sharp intuition and relentless drive. But this case was different. It was personal. Sarah had grown up in Millfield. She knew the Johnsons. She had coached Tommy's little league team. "This isn't just arson," she told Sheriff Edwards during a strategy meeting. "It's murder disguised as fire." She believed the killer was using fire as a weapon, a tool to control, to intimidate, to send a message. Strange markings at the Johnson crime scene deepened the mystery. On the gym floor of the local school, charred scorch marks formed a pattern, a circle enclosing symbols that resembled ancient runes. Fire investigators and police consultants debated the meaning. Some saw a ritualistic element, a dark signature left behind by the killer, a symbol of power or warning. Others argued it was a deliberate distraction, a false trail to mislead the investigation. But to the town, it was terrifying proof that the fires were more than vandalism. They were part of something darker. As the Johnson murders made headlines, reporters flooded Millfield. News vans parked along Main Street. Cameras captured the grief-stricken faces of townsfolk. National networks broadcast live from the town square. The sudden attention was overwhelming for a town and used to tragedy on such a scale. Stories about the arson murders dominated the news cycle, drawing comparisons to infamous serial killers of the past. Speculation swirled. Was the killer a local with grudges? A drifter passing through? Someone with ties to the Johnson family? Conspiracy theories blossomed online. Some suggested insurance fraud gone wrong. Others whispered about cult activity. But the truth remained elusive. Detective Collins reached out to a specialist in occult symbols. The expert identified the markings as resembling a rarely used symbol for destruction and rebirth in ancient mysticism. It was a chilling connection, as if the killer believed he was purging the town with fire, creating something new from the ashes. In the aftermath, Millfield became a town of mourners. Marie's sister, Helen, spoke publicly about the family's loss. "We never imagined something like this could happen here," she said, voice breaking. "Our hearts are shattered." Tommy's best friend, Michael, recounted their last conversation. "He was excited about college, about the future," Michael said. "It's hard to believe that's all gone now." Families gathered for vigils, clinging to each other in shared grief. Curfews were discussed. Neighborhood watches formed. Every shadow was suspect. Every stranger eyed with suspicion. The volunteer fire department's chief, Jerry Wallace, felt the weight of the tragedy deeply. "We're fighting a war against an invisible enemy," he told reporters. "And every time we lose, it hurts more than just buildings." Weeks after the Johnson murders, a fire broke out at the historic Millfield Church. But this time, firefighters arrived swiftly, containing the blaze before it spread. Inside the burnt pews, investigators found a fresh clue, a handwritten note, scorched at the edges but legible. It read, "From ashes, truth is born. Watch and listen." The fires had evolved from destructive acts into brutal messages, weapons wielded with terrifying precision. Millfield was no longer just a town battling flames. It was fighting for its very soul. As the investigation deepened, one terrifying question hung in the air. Who was setting the fires, and why were they willing to kill to keep their secrets? The air in Millfield was thick with smoke, but now, it wasn't just the scent of burning wood that permeated the town. It was the acrid taste of fear and betrayal. The Johnson murders had shattered the fragile peace, but as the investigation deepened, the walls around Millfield's darkest secrets began to crumble, revealing a truth far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Mark Donovan, once the town's prime suspect, was suddenly exonerated in a way no one saw coming. New evidence surfaced, a grainy surveillance video showing Mark miles away from the Barton barn on the night it burned to the ground. Witnesses who had accused him recanted their statements, admitting their fear and suspicion had clouded their judgment. Sheriff Edwards publicly cleared Mark's name, urging the town to stop scapegoating the loner. But for many, the damage was done. The town's obsession with Mark Donovan lingered like a festering wound, even as the real threat slipped deeper into the shadows. Then, a new figure came into focus, a man who had long hidden behind a mask of respectability, Deputy Sheriff Frank Halloway. Frank was the embodiment of trust in Millfield, a lifelong resident, a decorated officer, and the kind of man people looked to for safety. But beneath his clean-cut exterior lay a web of secrets darker than the night's flames. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. During routine checks of fire scenes, investigators found traces of a rare accelerant, one linked to a chemical used exclusively by a local factory where Frank's wife worked. More chillingly, Frank's alibi for the night of the Johnson murders was shaky. He claimed to have been on patrol, but several co-workers could not confirm his whereabouts. The pieces began to fall into place. As detectives dug deeper, Frank's motive emerged in terrifying clarity. Underneath Millfield's surface lurked an underground human trafficking ring, a cruel, clandestine world that preyed on the vulnerable. Frank, it seemed, was not just a lawman but a predator. The fires were a calculated cover-up, destroying evidence and silencing victims. Each blaze erased proof of horrors no one dared speak aloud. In a remote wooded area, search teams uncovered a shallow grave. Inside lay the remains of a young woman, her body bound and battered. The forensic team identified her as a recent missing person, a local teenager who had vanished without a trace weeks before. The brutality of her death was beyond description. Multiple fractures, signs of prolonged abuse, and indications she had been unconscious when burned alive. Millfield's nightmare was no longer abstract. It was flesh and blood. The revelation shattered Millfield's faith. How could one of their own protectors be the architect of such evil? At a hastily called town meeting, voices shook with rage and grief. "Betrayal," one mother whispered. "He was supposed to keep us safe." Sheriff Edwards struggled to maintain order, his own shock evident. "We must face the truth," he said solemnly, "and bring this monster to justice." With mounting evidence, law enforcement orchestrated a sting. Undercover agents infiltrated the trafficking ring, gathering damning proof. They tracked transactions, mapped networks, and pieced together Frank's role as kingpin. The operation culminated in a dramatic raid. Frank was arrested at his home, where officers found chilling evidence. Detailed plans for future fires, photos of victims, weapons, and bags of accelerants. His face was cold, eyes empty of remorse. The courtroom became a theater of horror. Prosecutors laid out the grisly details of Frank's crimes. Survivors testified, their voices trembling as they recounted unspeakable abuse. The defense tried to paint a picture of a man overwhelmed by circumstance, but the evidence was overwhelming. Frank's own confessions sealed his fate. He spoke of cleansing the town, purifying it with fire. His twisted ideology sent chills through the courtroom. Millfield was left scarred beyond repair. Families mourned, and the town grappled with a deep sense of betrayal. Support groups formed, counselors were brought in, and the community struggled to rebuild trust. Mark Donovan, once vilified, became an unlikely symbol of resilience. He spoke openly about his struggles with mental health, urging others not to judge based on fear. Though Frank was convicted, whispers remained. Were others involved? Were all the fires accounted for? Some believed the arson spree was just the tip of the iceberg. Millfield's fires had been born of deception, fed by betrayal, and fanned by human cruelty. Yet amid the ashes, a glimmer of hope remained. The town's scars were deep, but its spirit endured. In the end, the flames had revealed a truth the town could no longer ignore. The break in the case came like a thunderclap on a clear day, sudden, shocking, and undeniable. For months, Millfield had been suffocating under the weight of fear and suspicion. The once trusting community fractured by the arson spree and the horrific murders it masked. Detective Sarah Collins had been relentless, digging through the ashes of shattered lives, chasing elusive leads, and piecing together a puzzle that refused to fit. Then came the tip that would change everything. Fire investigators had long suspected the use of a rare accelerant, a chemical compound not commonly available to the public. It was sophisticated, volatile, and highly flammable. Through painstaking chemical analysis, it was traced back to a specific local factory, Millfield Chemicals, a sprawling industrial site on the outskirts of town. The factory specialized in specialty lubricants and chemical additives for manufacturing plants across the region. What made the connection chilling was the exclusivity. Only a handful of employees had access to the compound used in the fires. Among them was Deputy Sheriff Frank Halloway. The Millfield Police Department, in cooperation with state investigators, ramped up surveillance. Hidden cameras were installed near the factory, monitoring entrances and exits. For days, footage was reviewed, looking for suspicious activity. One night, a figure emerged on tape, slipping into the chemical storage area after hours, carrying containers suspiciously similar to those used in the fires. The man wore a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Though the grainy footage obscured his identity, his movements were methodical, confident, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The breakthrough came when a security officer recognized the figure as none other than Deputy Sheriff Frank Halloway. Frank had been abusing his position of trust to orchestrate the fires, leveraging his knowledge of law enforcement procedures to evade suspicion. Detectives were stunned. How had they missed it? How could one of their own be the mastermind behind the terror that had gripped Millfield? With the smoking gun footage, investigators obtained a search warrant for Frank's home. What they found was chilling. Boxes filled with detailed plans for future fires. Photos of victims, many with faces scratched out, replaced by cryptic symbols. Bags of accelerants, matches, and homemade incendiary devices. A journal chronicled his twisted ideology, a delusional manifesto about purifying the town through fire and fear. In a tense pre-dawn raid, officers arrested Frank at his home. His face was emotionless as he was led away in handcuffs. Neighbors watched in disbelief as the man they had trusted for years was exposed as a monster. Interrogations peeled back layers of Frank's sinister world. He revealed his involvement in an underground human trafficking ring, a network preying on the vulnerable, protected by fear and violence. The fires had been set to cover up evidence, destroy bodies, and intimidate potential witnesses. Frank spoke coldly of cleaning Millfield, erasing those he deemed unworthy. His words sent shivers through the investigative team. The revelation of Frank's double life rocked Millfield to its core. The betrayal by a law enforcement officer cut deeper than any wound. Families grieved anew, anger and sorrow entwined. Town meetings were held to address healing and rebuilding trust. In the weeks that followed, Millfield began the slow process of recovery. Counselors and support groups were established for survivors and families. Mark Donovan, once a suspect, became a vocal advocate for mental health awareness and community solidarity. The smoking gun was more than evidence. It was a symbol of justice reclaimed from the flames. Millfield's story was one of darkness and light, of terror and resilience. As the fires were finally extinguished, the town faced its future with cautious hope. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation and dread. For Millfield, the trial of Deputy Sheriff Frank Halloway was more than a legal proceeding. It was the moment the town confronted its darkest nightmare face to face. Families, survivors, and townsfolk filled the benches, many barely able to contain the flood of emotions that had been building for months. The Johnson family's empty seats were a haunting reminder of the lives stolen in the fires. From the very first day of testimony, the horror of what had happened in the Johnson farmhouse unfolded in chilling detail. Forensic experts described the violent nature of the murders. Harold Johnson's body showed signs of severe blunt force trauma. Fractured ribs, a crushed sternum, and a fractured skull likely caused by repeated strikes from a heavy object. Marie Johnson bore similar injuries, but with additional defensive wounds, indicating a desperate struggle. Tommy Johnson, the teenage son, had sustained multiple fractures consistent with being struck and then restrained. The medical examiner testified that Tommy was likely unconscious before the fire was set, trapped inside a locked room. The fire itself was designed not just to kill but to obliterate evidence. Experts described the use of accelerants to intensify the flames and prevent discovery. The depth of the brutality sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The prosecution presented damning evidence connecting Frank Halloway's motive to the Johnson family. Harold Johnson had recently uncovered signs of human trafficking linked to Millfield's underground network, the very one Frank was orchestrating. Harold's refusal to stay silent and his attempts to report suspicious activities had made him a target. Marie Johnson's community involvement and Tommy's connections to youth groups threatened to expose the ring further. Frank's rage was fueled not only by a desire to protect his illicit operations, but also by a twisted need to assert control through fear. The courtroom was thick with emotion as survivors recounted the toll Frank's crimes had taken. One witness, a young woman who had escaped the trafficking ring, broke down describing the horrors she endured and how Frank's fires had been used to silence others. Families of the victims expressed heartbreak, anger, and a desperate need for justice. Frank's defense attempted to portray him as a man overwhelmed by circumstances, suffering from mental illness. But as evidence mounted, the facade crumbled. In a harrowing moment, Frank confessed to the murders in chilling detail. He described the Johnson killings as necessary sacrifices in his warped crusade to purify Millfield. His confession included gruesome details: the methodical beating of Harold and Marie, the terror in Tommy's eyes as he was locked away, the final act of setting their home ablaze while they still breathed. After weeks of testimony, the jury found Frank Halloway guilty on multiple counts: first-degree murder, arson, human trafficking, and abuse of office. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Though justice was served, the scars ran deep. Counselors worked with families and survivors, helping the community grapple with grief and betrayal. The town held memorials for the Johnsons and other victims, vowing to rebuild. The fires had burned houses, but more devastatingly, they had burned trust, safety, and innocence. Millfield's story was a brutal reminder of how evil can hide behind familiar faces, and how the flames of violence leave lasting marks on a community's soul. The fires that had once engulfed Millfield had finally been extinguished, but their echoes lingered, etched into the memories of every resident and scarred into the town's very fabric. Justice had been served. Frank Halloway was behind bars, his monstrous acts laid bare before the world. Yet the aftermath was a slow, painful reckoning. In the weeks following the trial, Millfield began the slow process of healing. The streets still bore signs of the destruction: the charred remains of homes, the skeletal frames of barns, and the empty lots where beloved buildings once stood. But beneath the rubble, a community slowly rekindled its spirit. Neighbors helped neighbors rebuild. Fundraisers brought together those who had been divided by fear and suspicion. Local leaders, survivors, and ordinary citizens formed coalitions focused on renewal. For the families who lost loved ones, healing was far from simple. Helen Johnson, sister to Marie, dedicated herself to advocacy, campaigning tirelessly for victim support services and awareness of trafficking. Mark Donovan, once the town's outcast, found a surprising role as a community counselor, using his own struggles to help others understand the dangers of judgment and fear. Despite Frank's conviction, not all mysteries were solved. Investigators acknowledged that the trafficking ring likely extended beyond Millfield. Others wondered if more fires had been set by accomplices yet to be uncovered. The scars of betrayal and loss remained a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil can hide behind trusted faces. For many, the deepest wound was not the loss of property, but the loss of innocence. Children who once played freely now struggled with nightmares. Parents who once felt safe behind locked doors wrestled with a newfound vulnerability. Millfield was no longer the idyllic town it had once been, but within its people burned a fierce resilience. They refused to be defined by tragedy. Instead, they chose to honor their lost by building a safer, stronger community. The story of Millfield's fires is a somber reminder. The most destructive flames are often those fueled by betrayal, secrecy, and cruelty. Yet, in the ashes of despair, the human spirit can find light. Millfield's journey, from smoke and terror to hope and healing, stands as a testament to the strength that arises when a community refuses to be consumed. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe and join our community, where we uncover the deepest, darkest truths hiding just beneath the surface. Explore more chilling true crime stories, and never stop questioning what lies beyond the smoke. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and dive into our growing vault of true crime mysteries that keep getting deeper, darker, and more twisted. Join a community that's unafraid to face the flames, ask the hard questions, and seek the truth hiding in the smoke. Because here, every story matters, and the next one might just be the one you never saw coming. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and until next time, keep your eyes open. The truth is always watching.